Welcome to Be Hero Fights. I'm Tom,
And I'm Brian.
and we're here to discuss
Or Fuss.
over two hotly debated, highly related topics.
Last week, we gave you guys a sneak peek at one of our great new podcasts coming to Be Hero Media, the Bump Card Wrestling Podcast, where myself and my new partner, Nick, will be talking wrestling of all varieties as well as bringing in guests. So if you guys haven't heard that, go listen to it and then keep informed with our social medias when we're going to drop that fully. But guys, we're back to form here. We're going to be talking about a great battle tonight. But before we get into that, let's go ahead and do our normal comments.
Yeah. So one of the questions that we posed through our social medias not too long ago was who was the best Sherlock Holmes out of Robert Downey Jr. and Benedict Cumberbatch.
Okay.
And we got a couple comments from you guys. First off, from a Friday Island podcast, they said Robert Downey Jr. all the way. Yeah, he's a great choice. I like both of them, but I think actually I think I might think Benedict is closer to the book version of the character, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I loved the Sherlock Holmes take on BBC. Again, I like the stories that they did with the movies they did with Robert Downey Jr., where it's fairly well played into how the books were. But I loved Benedict Cumberbatch's take on it. I mean, he's got one of the greatest lines in it. You know, he kills a guy and goes, "I'm not a psychopath. I'm a high functioning autistic," or something like that. And it's such a good line, especially to like do that and then kill a guy. So good. Anyhow, all right. Next comment under the same thing, talking about who's better between RDJ and Cumberbatch. Is Cavill underscore JJ says Cumberbatch is probably the more rigorous adaptation, but Downey Jr. is really interesting as well. Love them both. TBH, which I have no clue what that stands for. But again, like it's really to what you take. Like if you're interested in a character who's a little more on the silly side, but has got the intellect and everything else and is really entertaining, you might want to go towards Robert Downey Jr.'s take. But if you want the more serious, more authentic version of Sherlock Holmes, it might be Benedict.
Yeah. I mean that kind of is the best way to sum it up. The Disney versions of Sherlock Holmes are super fun. They're very approachable. They're more along the lines of an action versus like a detective thriller. But they're very entertaining, very good to watch. Robert Downey Jr. kills it. But yeah, I think just for kind of the classic whodunit type thing, Benedict Cumberbatch is in my mind kind of a more iconic Sherlock Holmes.
It's very true, but they both pale in comparison to the Great Mouse Detective. So
Agreed.
so but
Can
with
I
that being
weigh
said,
in?
well, since he brought it up, joining us tonight for this great episode is the scene snob himself, Mick Manhattan. Welcome back, Mick.
Thank you for having me, guys. I love debating you guys. And this, arguing Sherlock Holmes, like I love that. I didn't listen to that episode. I gotta go back and listen to it. Although, if I can say, the best Sherlock Holmes is Jeremy Brett from the 1984 TV series. Everybody wants to check it out. And Nicholas Rowe from Young Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah.
But if I had to weigh in, it would be Benedict.
Gotcha.
Well, guys, since we have Mick here joining us, and we all know how the Scene Snobs are, and they are huge about not just horror, but movies in general, we wanted to bring him in for our first horror episode for the month of October.
First official horror episode, yes.
First official, yes. I mean, if you want to see some real horror, go back and listen to the Bump Card podcast episode we just did. But with that being said, guys, Mick's going to be joining us on the great battle of who is the better character, the Ghost Rider, Johnny Blaze, or Spawn. Al. Oh, my brain just turned off on his name again.
Al Simmons.
Simmons.
Al Simmons. I don't like. He wants to say Al Morris. I don't know why. Yes, the great battle between uh, Ghost Rider's Johnny Blaze or Spawn's Al Simmons. So we're gonna go jump right into that. Before we do, guys, though, don't forget to hit up our social medias so you guys can be a part of some of these great debates we've had on our social medias, such as those Sherlock Holmes ones, or some of the other ones we've been doing with some food and other things. So hit us up on our social medias, such as
Facebook.com/BeHeroMedia, Instagram.com/BeHeroMedia.
on Twitter at BeHeroFights or BeHeroMedia, as well as you can go right down here in the comments and whatever you wish to talk to us about and everything else. Hit that subscribe button while you're there and the notification bell. And if you want to find us in any podcasting form, go to BeHeroMedia.com so you can listen to everything great on there.
Exactly.
So.
Yeah, I'm actually pretty excited about this fight. Two of my all-time favorite comic book characters, and definitely the two most appropriate to put against each other for the Halloween season.
Oh yeah.
Two hellish nightmare characters, anti-heroes, and I'm a huge fan of both. And in this case, so I actually messed up my back, so I'm all loopy on pain meds right now. So I'm gonna be doing my best to judge. Audience, hold me accountable. And Brian and Mick are going to be fighting. So, Mick,
Yep.
which one are you going to be fighting for?
Johnny Blaze, the Ghost Rider.
Yikes.
Very cool. Very cool.
Love it.
Well, that leaves me with Spawn. So me and Al, we're gonna have this down, man. So we're gonna get this going. All right.
You
Well,
just
Mick,
lost what little of street cred you had is gone.
I didn't have any to begin with, but
I can tell you
I think you're in debt now.
We can make this a short episode. Tom, which movie would you rather watch?
Oh boy.
And we have two. Remember, there's two Ghost Riders, and one has.
I know, but can I say the animated HBO series for Spawn? Because that's actually good.
No,
Yes.
never, because that is good, and that wins every time.
Damn right it does.
Of the 3 movies released, I will just put it out there that the newest one, the sequel with Nicolas Cage, while it still was bad, it at least looked really good.
Yeah, I would give
so.
It was quite shiny.
So shiny.
Well, all right, guys. Y'all know how this works. So we go through our 3 rounds. First round, second round, final thoughts. So let's go ahead and jump right into that. Mick, why don't you start us off with
round 1. Fight.
All right. So I'm adamantly defending the Ghost Rider. Arguably one of the strongest heroes in Marvel history. Debuted in '72. Johnny Blaze is the first iteration of him. Still exists in elements today. But he's kind of been throughout. But there have been other versions that I'm not covering at this juncture. I will say he's iconic. I mean, what has Ghost Rider given to pop culture? Let's think about it. Motorcycle fans love him.
Oh yeah.
They wish they had his bike. He's got the best. He's probably the best, coolest looking character in comic book history, in my opinion. I mean, he's pretty rad. And I'm not taking anything away from Spawn. Spawn's cool too.
Oh yeah.
I do have to mention that because I don't want anybody like commenting and saying like, "How do you hate Spawn?" I don't hate Spawn. Love Spawn. But Ghost Rider, especially the Johnny Blaze rendition, who brought the originality of the look to it. Movies aside, he was always the best. He was always the character, and especially in Marvel, you looked forward to teaming up, and he did that a lot.
Oh yeah.
And when he showed up, it was on. Now Johnny Blaze, because I'm arguing for him, there's a lot of very epic things that he's done, but a lot of those I can't mention because they involved other Ghost Riders as well, doing those epic things. But he's stronger than he's as strong as the Hulk, and stronger than any other. Thor can't beat him unless Thor has the cosmic powers. And even then, Thor beat Frank Castle. He didn't beat Johnny Blaze. So that's a win in my book. And if you can beat Thor with Mjolnir, it makes you epic, in my opinion. Now Johnny Blaze has a ton of powers that I think hold up and are very cool. The number one being the penance stare, which for any comic fans watching, I'm going to say, I know it was Danny Ketch who had the penance stare first, but I already brought this up. He did get it in the 2000s. Johnny Blaze does have the penance stare, and it was in the movies, so of course, canon there. It's just he's epic on so many levels, and later you find out it's Mephisto, but it was the devil originally who imbued him with his powers, and which I think is another very cool for Marvel storyline. Like you have this Daredevil that just gets, sells his soul and becomes a spirit of vengeance. I think that's amazing, and there have been countless stories and countless team ups that have added to that as well. Plus, he can ride his motorcycle vertical on buildings.
Super sweet.
It's
I
very
didn't even
true.
mention the Hellfire.
Right? All right. Well, Spawn is very, very similar in the aspect of Ghost Rider. They have very similar abilities, of like with the chains and the abilities of doing Hellfire and things as they go on. But Spawn, Al Simmons, Al Simmons was considered the greatest assassin while he was alive, right? And he was betrayed and killed by his supposed best friend, and was sent to hell and made a deal with the devil. It was another demon, to go back because he wanted to be with his wife Wanda, right? And he becomes a hell spawn in that aspect. But when he does get sent back, he remembers nothing when he comes back at first. But what he ends up doing is defending the weak and the beggars and everybody else and becoming one of the greatest anti-heroes of all time. And even outside of that, it's what Spawn has done for the world of comics in general. I mean, like Ghost Rider, he's got a very iconic look. I will put those two right up next to each other as two of the most badass looking people. Maybe throw Lobo in there too. But some of the most badass looking like cartoon or characters of all time in comics. But you have one of the greatest artists, arguably, of all time, being not only the creator of his design and look, but the writer in Todd McFarlane, right? Todd McFarlane started doing Spider-Man and switched over in '92 to go to Image to do this. And Spawn has been such an iconic character for a third-party comic book. It was one of the first non comic books movies to come out, especially in the '90s. It wasn't the first by any means, but it was one of the first that was non the like Marvel or DC big string comic books to come out, and it's so beloved by so many people. I'm trying to do my best to give it justice because it's just so beloved by people. Spawn has some great abilities as well as what I mentioned before, where he is able to use essentially his essence, known as neoplasm, like nectoplasm, to be able to use his abilities with. So you have his chains, his hellfire, his ability to shapeshift, and everything else. He uses his cape for all kinds of things. His suit itself is his abilities. But he also falls back on his ability as an assassin. So he uses guns and everything all the time too. If you go to the movie, he's got a pretty neat ride as well, especially when he covers it in the cape. But
Listen, you sir,
it's
fucking
not
movie
up.
bikes.
It's not up there with Johnny's bike, but it's pretty rad too, especially when he cloaks it in there. Man, is that shielded the version? I personally I adored the movie. It's so campy and so bad, but it's bad in a good way. But all right. So with that being said, let's go ahead and go over to
Round 2. Fight.
Only rebut that I rebuke that I have to this is his bike is not cooler in that movie than Johnny Blaze's. And even the first movie, and that is an abomination to movies.
That it is.
I love Ghost Rider, and I was so heartbroken by that movie. And I love Nick Cage, so don't get me wrong. And I know Nick Cage knows Ghost Rider. Just got dismantled. But that bike is awesome, and it's great in the second one. It's epic. So if we are going bikes, think we have a clear winner with the Hellfire wheels.
For sure.
And I think we have to give it to. I think you have to give that portion to Johnny Blaze because he is a stunt motorcycle. You know, like Spawn's not known for having a motorcycle. So I win, right? That's how. No, I'm just kidding.
Oh, we're going by just those. I would pull out Ghost Rider's other buddy, Ronnie Raymond, and give me that Charger, man. That Charger's pimp.
Oh, the 69 that's the best. Absolutely. Even Danny Catches, like, you know, if we're arguing the motorcycles, yeah, I mean, or the cars, like, yeah, absolutely. That would be a cool argument.
Yeah, it would.
Comic book.
If you guys want to see that as a future one, hit us up here in the comments.
There you go. But so just to kind of argue, it's so hard to argue against Spawn, and I'm finding this now. You know, when I was reading up on everything, and I was like, okay, you know, this is my argument. I was like, this is gonna be easy, no problem. I'm like, it's Spawn, he's so bad. But with Ghost Rider, it's right. The pen and stare, first and foremost, to me, is probably the coolest power because nobody is immune to it. The only character in Marvel that wasn't immune to it was Frank Castle.
Yeah.
And that's because he truly believed he was justified in what he was doing.
Yeah.
So there was no guilt, which I think is in and of itself is amazing. But then you go back and you take the Hellfire. I mean, the man spews volcanic amounts of hellfire, and nothing can withstand it. It's brilliant. Like you stand in a room with the guy, and like that's it. Like you're done. His hellfire chain, everything, all the way down. Like he doesn't even really have to lift a finger, and he's gonna take you out. Not to mention the strength and everything else that he does. So. But going back, and we were talking about like story wise, I think the Haunted, like he wanted to save his father. Like I love Spawn's story. I love where Spawn went. But Johnny Blaze's story of like he just wanted to save his dad. You know, it was a boy, you know, basically a young man just wanting to save his dad, selling his soul to the devil and taking this and doing so much good with it. Becoming a true and honest hero that even the heroes call when they need. Like when it really comes down to it, like, you know, even a World War Hulk is a big proof of that.
Oh yeah.
You know, they went to Ghost Rider and they're like, like we need Ghost Rider's help here because he's the only one who's gonna help. And he will protect the innocent. That's his main goal. And I love that. I love that he will. It does not matter how justified you feel. He'll protect the innocent. And you know he's from hell. You know he sold his soul, and he's a hellish demon, basically. You know I just think, and just the size and magnitude. Like we have Spawn for what, 25 years.
92. So yeah, 20.
A little bit more, about
8 years, 29 years.
Oh no, so 92
20.
You said so.
Yeah, so it'll be 30 years next year.
Yeah, so it's a big anniversary. Go for Spawn.
Yeah.
But for me, Ghost Rider coming out in 72, a long time. It's almost 50 years he's been around. Next year, 50 years. And has always been. I don't think I've ever met anybody who didn't like Ghost Rider, even if they didn't know him. Like my kids got a Lego set of Ghost Rider. It was a Spider-Man Lego set, but it had Robbie Reyes' Dodge Charger and him. And my kids saw it. Never read Ghost Rider. They haven't seen the movies. They don't really know Ghost Rider. And as soon as he got it, I was like, you have a Ghost Rider Lego set. I was like, I'm building this with you, and I hate Lego, so I'm in. We're doing this. And like I'm sitting there the whole time telling them the story of Johnny Blaze, Robbie Reyes, Danny Ketch, the whole 9 yards. And I was so excited about it. And I like that he's even on that level where kids can get it. Spawn, I would not say that about. Like, I think you need to be a little bit older to kind of even appreciate where Spawn's coming.
No. And I think you're right. It is also one of the comic books that was somewhat aimed towards an adult demographic in the comics concept, where the turn of that comic thing in '92, where you had like Marvel Black or Marvel Max or DC Black, excuse me, or Marvel Max that came out all those times, where they're aiming towards those adult things. But before I go into telling you why Spawn is better, I want to just take real fast. Ghost Rider was actually the very first comic I ever read. And I picked it up off the rack solely because it was a dude with a flaming head of like a flaming skull on a bike. Like literally the whole reason I picked it up off the rack initially, and then tried to convince my Jehovah Witness grandmother to let me buy it. It was a good time. And then like in the newer Spider-Man game that just came out from a few years now from Insomniac, one of the skins and the one I played with all the time was the Spider-Man when he's possessed by the cosmic Ghost Rider skin. So he's got a flaming blue head, and he's wearing the Spider-Man suit and everything else because it's the most iconic looking thing. Like going with that. That all being said, Spawn is exactly what I said it was. It was a character aimed towards an adult range. It's really one of the first ones that kind of started that trend, like I mentioned before about the DC Black or the Max in Marvel, where they were aiming towards more of adult themes, where you get things like Jessica Jones and other ones like that came from the Max series. Some of the greatest things from Punisher that was done between Punisher Max and Punisher War Journals that was done later was because they followed in suit with the ability what Spawn had done and Tom McFarlane had done. So Tom McFarlane leaves Marvel to go to Image, right? A floundering, somewhat third level comic book. I'm sorry, Mick. I didn't mean to make you upset.
Yeah, I'm getting a little pissed here. No, I'm sorry. I'm holding a pen and I dropped it on top of my.
Okay. But
Making
so
notes.
he moves over to Image, right? Somewhat floundering, but doing decent as a third level. Spawn comes out, right? There's so much hype behind Spawn and everything else. The first issue does 1.7 million copies. A comic book for a third party company. Some of the biggest ones of all time did not have that kind of numbers, especially in the first year they came out, right? Image was literally like they went on the back of Spawn. The only reason we don't even know Image is somewhat to this point now, or having the ability of still seeing things from Image Comics, or had seen them from Image Comics in the '90s, was due to how beloved Spawn was, how great of a story and comic book run it was done. You go through everything that you learn in Spawn, from him trying to figure out who he is, to learning about an old Spawn that learned how to get out of being a hell spawn in Castellagro, and to trying to find out about Wanda and finding out that Wanda has been married to somebody else, and that they have a kid together, and he protects them as part of his family. And then later on, after another Spawn comes along and everything else, and we lose out with Al Simmons, we find out later on Al Simmons is essentially taken over Hell after he kills himself and becomes the Omega Spawn. And then there's other things where he goes into heaven, becomes the Heaven Spawn, or the Heaven Spawn, and there's so many great things. Spawn has taken on the Satan and God at the same time in one, right? You can't find a character who can do that in general, let alone somebody from a third party company like that. And then you have, as we mentioned earlier, the HBO Spawn series, which was one of the biggest things for HBO in the animated section during that time in the late '90s. HBO didn't have any of that. They had like, the Oz and The Wire and things like that. And then they came out with the 2 seasons of Spawn on HBO, and it blew up. Like I still go back and watch it because that's still available on HBO Max. It is fantastic.
Mhm.
There is nothing that like, and I'm doing this as explaining that Ghost Rider and Spawn are so close together. You talked about strength. Spawn has strength, superhuman
Mhm.
strength as well. He's put a building up on his back and lifted it, right? So his strength is close to it. There's the Penton Stare, but you have all the abilities that Spawn has with his cloak and his shape shifting and his changing and things that he can do. So, apples to oranges, or apples to apples, they're very close to each other in how their abilities are and how their powers are and everything else. I'm going more on to Todd McFarlane's great ability of telling a story, the art he has done
Mhm.
for it, the famous art he has done for it, and the action figures that have gone along with it. Spawn's probably one of the most like sought after action figures because of the look and design. And then what they did for a floundering third party company known as Image Comics and becoming 1.7 billion in their first year. Or excuse me, 1.7 million in their first year is a release of Spawn. That Ghost Rider is great, but Ghost Rider has always been outside of the handful of times where he's had his solo runs. He's always been that other guy in the bring that they bring in. Like he was part of the
Mhm.
Fantastic Four for a minute when they needed to replace the Fantastic Four because they needed to do something with him. He was part of the Avengers for a while. He's West Coast Avengers even for a while. Like they've had him as a great character, but they never give him enough faith to put a whole run and a whole company on his back.
Oh,
And
no, 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 no. I'll argue that. He had a run for a very long time.
no,
He
a
had his
whole
own
run.
Ghost Rider.
Yeah, I'm not saying he didn't have a whole run. I'm saying the whole run that put a studio on his back, like Spawn did. So,
Fair, but in fairness to that, like, it is a dream story that Image, which was a fledgling company,
mm,
of talented artists that put it together, independent artists, and Spawn came and was a phenomenon. Don't get me wrong, I will not take that away from them.
hmm
But it was riding Spawn for a long time. So it's like, yes, it was on its back, but it's like you didn't give us much else for a while. Like Spawn was the one carrying you. Whereas with Ghost Rider, yes, you could say like he is the guy that they put on the Avengers, they put on Fantastic Four, but that connection on a lot of those teams and a lot of those team ups didn't go to a lot of other characters. And I mean, that is the Avengers. It's, you know,
yeah,
granted there have been a lot of Avengers members, but he was one of the main members when he joined the Avengers. And now granted I will fight against my own point here by saying that Avengers team wasn't the strongest team as we know it now, because there were Iron Man wasn't on it and Cap wasn't there and stuff like that, and Hulk wasn't there. But then you say Fantastic Four, and he became a member of the Fantastic. That's no slouch to become a member of the Fantastic Four, and I
by
wouldn't
no
even say
means.
that's like, oh, they threw Ghost Rider there. Like Ghost Rider was invited to be on the Fantastic Four. Like that's a big thing. That's how and that's one of the most epic and oldest superhero teams of all time. So I think that is more of you wear that more as an award than anything. Wear a badge of honor.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, the Fantastic Four were the first family of comics, right?
Mhm.
And I mean, they're kind of the resurgence of comics. So yes, you're right. Having that mantle of being one of um, the backups, the junior varsity, as you would for the Fantastic Four, being him, where you also have like Spider Man and some others on there. You are 100% right. I'm not taking anything away from that. I'm talking about as writing. Like
Oh yeah.
if you think of some of the stories that you can see in what Ghost Rider has, right? Um, you don't have a character on the same level as, say, like the Vindicator that you do with Spawn, where you have uh, the demon whose name escapes me because they always go with these really random names. For Spawn's demon that did a deal with him, we'll just call him the Devil for now. So he has the Devil, just like Johnny does. But
Mhm.
then you also have the Vindicator, which, mind you, the best thing about the old Spawn movie was John Leguizamo's Vindicator. That was so good. I love the clown. That's probably my favorite part of that whole thing. But and then you have him going up against God at one point. You have him going up against other Hellspawns. You have him going up against drug dealers and other things like that. You have similar ones in there where it comes to Ghost Rider, but it always feels like it's the guy of the next day when it comes to Ghost Rider, where it doesn't like I used to read a ton of Ghost Rider comics. Like I said, it was my first comic I ever read, but it was almost always Mephisto and something, or this was done by Mephisto. Like Mephisto was almost always his big bag. There was never almost really another thing to go with him against that. Where you had Spawn, who was constantly having like things he's fighting against and trying to people he's going against, from like his best friend who killed him to the boss that they had in the CIA who hired him to do or hired his best friend to kill him and convince him of that. Then you have the Satan and everything else. You have a stronger story base in there. But even outside of all that, like I've mentioned, these are apples to apples when it comes to these characters. It's what Spawn has done for comic books in general, showing that another company could have of something that big. You can't do that with Ghost Rider, sadly. Ghost Rider's amazing. I think he's one of the greatest Marvel characters of all time, in my personal opinion. I love him in almost everything he does. But I don't think the stories right now, they haven't, at least they haven't had a great writer on there to be able to give him a good enough story arc to be able to run that. Like, I used to think the same thing with Doctor Strange until only a couple years ago. Doctor Strange didn't really have,
Ooh.
he had some great
I
stories, but
mean,
not the best stories.
I think you're very wrong by Ghost Rider.
Yeah.
The problem is there you're comparing 70s and 80s Marvel to Spawn, which was in the 90s and was a very different time for storytelling where you
For
could
sure.
tell different type of stories. Now, and I'm arguing for that 70s. You know, if I'm arguing for again the entity that is Ghost Rider, you are grossly underestimating storylines of Ghost Rider. But because there have been some truly epic ones, and I mean, you got to remember all of the big bads, the true big bads that we know from almost every superhero, Ghost Rider has gone up, and you know
In his
he's
own
defeated
stories?
who?
In his own story run or in their story run?
Well,
Like
it's
he
usually
wrote.
in the epic runs that you
Hmm.
connected. Like it's you can say own storyline, but yeah, that's true. But Marvel
So
had this huge universe.
yeah,
Spawn had Image, and Spawn was Image.
Yeah.
So to argue that is actually arguing apples and oranges. So granted, Spawn had great enemies. Spawn had great storylines. I'm taking nothing away from Spawn, but Spawn was condensed, whereas Ghost Rider came in and he had to face this entire universe. And in a lot of cases, if we talk about the whole entity of who Ghost Rider is, in many different throughout the multiverse, I mean, he took on Galactus, he took
Yeah.
on King Thanos, he took on so many Hela. You know, there's been some truly amazing fights across the board, and stories there where Ghost Rider was essentially the hero for the heroes to step in and help out. So I mean, there have been some, and the Robbie Reyes. Now, if you want to talk storylines, Robbie Reyes' storyline is heartbreaking and beautiful and well
Oh
done.
yeah. Yeah, Robbie Reyes, the stories that they've done in these 2000s and the current version going on right now, they're amazing. But sadly, with Johnny, they just never gave him enough on there and by himself. Like, I'll compare it for you as this. So you're right, where there's a multitude of things in Marvel where you have multiple comics and multiple heroes and things like that. But for most of the late 70s and through the 90s, the number one comic run or comic character in Marvel was Spider-Man, right? And Spider-Man pretty much was all of Marvel, save the X-Men too, but I'm talking individual player characters. Spider-Man kind of was like the top tier. He was the top guy. And if you compare Spider-Man's run against what you did with Spawn, that's more comparable than what Spawn stuff is against Ghost Rider, because these are the two guys who are the top of their company. And so they have to have great stories with them. And they just never gave enough love to Johnny.
so I'm going to intervene here for just a second, and I want to talk a little bit more about kind of the universes that that are at play here. So, Brian, you brought up an interesting fact that uh, Spawn took on heaven and hell basically at the same time, and you know, all gangs like he didn't have a family or a team or anyone on it. He was thrown in with amnesia into this giant mess, and
Yep.
everyone wants him dead. Um, so like that is quite a feat, but that I think Mick, you hit really well with the fact that like yeah, but that's all there was. We didn't have this grand epic universe where like we have the Christian hell, if you will, that only seems to affect Earth, yet it's on par with like the hell from not Ragnar Norse mythology as well as the Greek hell. Like so we have all these different versions of deities and hell, and we have this giant universe and beings that are more powerful than God, if you will, right? So I think I want to talk about that a little bit more. So Brian, how do you justify Spawn being the better character when Mick is saying Ghost Rider, yes, he didn't take on heaven, but per
He did
se.
though. He took on heaven
Okay.
and he took on hell. Johnny Blaze.
Was it Johnny? I thought it was uh the second one whose name just escaped me.
Danny Ketch joined
Danny
him
Ketch.
as the
Okay.
second Ghost Rider, but it was Johnny Blaze who waged war.
Ah,
So,
but
Mick, do you think it's fair that Spawn did more by taking all that on with amnesia all at once? And Brian, do you think that what Spawn did is just as significant, even though it's technically a more grounded universe, if you will, grounded to Earth?
there's a heavy air quotes in that. Well, what do you think, Mick? Go ahead.
So am I arguing because you said it said Spawn for me? So like, is my argument for Spawn or is it
No,
on this one?
like,
Like,
you're trying to tell me why what Ghost Rider has to do is just as impressive, if not more impressive, than Spawn because of the universes.
because of the epic span in the universe, yeah. I mean, and again, it comes down to um what he has to deal with. Like, if you take Spider-Man, arguably, you say Spider-Man has the best rogues gallery, or
Oh, for sure.
you know, and but if you take the epic scale of everyone's top villain, Ghost Rider has had to confront them in major storylines over time. Now, that's his rogues gallery, and his number one is basically the devil of Marvel Universe. Like,
Yeah.
that scale of what Marvel was and what Ghost Rider was, he's an epic character everyone knows. That, yes, it can be argued that maybe his run wasn't as prolific as some of these huge superheroes, especially now that the movies exist. But it's still pretty prolific to be somebody who exists in this world, in this Marvel universe, and is very well known by everybody. Is the look kind of is what lures in younger viewers and readers, like you said yourself, me as well. When you see that flaming skull, you want to read the comic book. But I think the epic scale that is Marvel Universe and Ghost Rider's placement in it, and the fact that he is more powerful than probably the most powerful in terms of heroes, that's pretty big. I love that Spawn in his universe is such a force to be reckoned with. I appreciate that. And again, I love Spawn. This isn't me taking anything away from him, but if you're asking me who has more of a, now if you're asking me outside of comics, who is maybe a way more popular character, it is pretty even, but I'm going to go Spawn. That cartoon alone.
Right.
That cartoon alone. But you can't, like, if you're actually taking the two characters, that's why I was like with the movies and stuff, like, you can't really argue that because the characters are so much more than just those things.
It's true.
If but overall, if you're taking these characters and what they've done in their universes, I'm gonna give it to Johnny Blaze kicking everything off and still being alive today within the realm. But Ghost Rider in general.
Right on. Remind me what was your question again, Tom?
Though Spawn has a smaller universe, how does what he did? How is it still just as grandiose as what Ghost Rider has done?
Well, I think because he has a smaller universe, he's really the only hero out there. He's the only name in the game when it comes to his universe inside of Image, that he has to take all of that on his shoulders. When the devil tries to do an incursion into our world, right? The only thing that's saving us is Spawn. Spawn protects the lonely. He protects the bums. He protects the shutouts, and then he steps up and takes on protecting the world. And then when there's a war between heaven and hell, Spawn steps up to protect the people of the earth, so that you know no one gets hurt. No one. He does what he can to protect people because that's his redemption. That's what he's trying to do to redeem himself for all the stuff he had done. And part of the reason he went to hell was because as an assassin, he didn't care who he killed, but he's redeeming himself of that now with everything he has done. And also, before I forget, he does have a small crossover bit for a minute. There's a great run of Batman and Spawn together that was done with Frank Miller and Todd McFarlane, which means it's well, depending on who was writing, it was either going to be a really good story or a maybe good story. And it's going to be beautiful art. And it was. It was some great stuff. And they initially were meaning to have a long crossover, but they ended up having to scrap it and doing that one comic run that they did. But it was some beautiful, amazing stuff that they've done with that as well.
Yeah.
I want to point
Okay.
out, I have an entire collection of McFarlane figures. So I do not. I love McFarlane, probably one of the best, if not the best, in comic artists ever. But I do have a question about your argument there, Ryan. That argument. So with the smaller universe, I do agree. Like you're saying, like he is prolific within his universe, with what he steps up to do. But my argument there is like, okay, so he's probably on a par with like a Batman, with more power, of course.
Yeah.
You know, and he does in epic storylines does wage war against and in hell if he needs to. That's where my argument comes in for Ghost Rider, though. It's if the people are what are looking on to with Spawn, I would put him more on a level with than a Spider-Man, which is amazing. Don't get me wrong, and a Batman, which are two of the greatest comic book characters of all time, and in my opinion, would win. This argument, right, hands down. But
for sure.
talking about it from their universes, connecting or counting on them, Ghost Rider not only has the heavens and the hells and the multiverse and everybody else, the heroes count on him too. So to me, that just puts him, that edges him out a little.
With that too, I think it's a relative thing, because I agree with you in that fact that they often look to him to help out, and to essentially come in to do like here's our wild card thing. But Marvel, especially when they do those massive crossovers in the big storylines, they almost always have a character of that aspect, right? I mean, think of Civil War. Things are going awry. Cap is hiding with everybody else, and what happens? You get a knock on the door, and you've got Frank walking in with Spider-Man in his arms. That's the last savior kind of thing. And they do have or they've had that with Ghost Rider. But if they've had that with Ghost Rider, and they've had that with Frank, and they've had that with so many other characters that they're bringing back at a time, how does that make them any more special than any of the others? Where you have Spawn by himself, he's doing it all by himself. He can't call for backup. He can't call that hero's hero to come save him. He has to carry all of that universe on his back, and in addition, carrying Image on his back.
I have one more question before we go into final thoughts. This is going to be kind of changing the tune a little bit. I want to just talk about controversy. These are both very adult characters. Now, Ghost Rider, it took a bit longer for him to really go into more of just the mature audience line of comics because he started so much earlier, and the way the communications and especially in the United States was back then. Like, we didn't even have a PG-13 rating back then. Everything was very different, right? So
Yeah.
I think comic books are one of the mediums, and I would say one of the crucial mediums that has progressed, I think, American culture to being more open-minded and taking on these more mature themes. Uh, so I guess talk about the controversy and how you think yours is a has been a better push for our culture.
All right. Go
I'll
ahead,
let
Mick.
you take. Go ahead, Brian.
All right. Well, the thing is back to what I mentioned earlier. Um, you're right. There was a lot of controversy, and especially with somebody like Spawn that came around. But Spawn helped bring in not only Image, but bring in the more mature comic book of that realm. I mentioned earlier how around the same time you had Marvel Max and DC Black coming in, and I'd have to look to make sure, but I'm pretty sure it's in the coattails of Spawn or right down around the same time that it all happened. So you got some of the greatest darker stories of like I mentioned before, Punisher, or like the stuff with Jessica Jones, which is just so dark, and so many others in there. And then you have the DC Black's runs that they've done of those stories that are just dark. So you had Spawn kind of being the tip of the spear when it came to becoming more of a mature, adult-oriented comic book and dealing with the controversies there. With Ghost Rider, you had him going a little bit at the beginning in the 70s, but then they started having the what was it, the dynamic or the demon panic or whatever it was, the Satan panic, satanic panic, that's what it was, in the early 80s. And Ghost Rider sadly was one of those victims of that they had to chill him down. In fact, I believe, don't quote me on this, but I believe they stopped his run for a few years and just had him as side character bit in there during that time.
Mhm.
So it would be hard to say that he really embraced that controversy and added to more mature stuff. But I'll leave that to you, Mike.
All right. So, all right. Now I'm listening to your question, Tom, or I'm listening to your answer, and Tom, what exactly are
I guess
with your question? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I guess
What were you
like how has it affected our like American culture, comic book culture, geek culture, something that having
saying?
these two characters, which one do you think has had the bigger impact uh, towards bringing out better storytelling and better themes for our culture?
Okay. Um, Thinking about it from that angle and what you said, Brian, uh, who had the bigger impact on the comic book industry? Hands down, no argument. Spawn. I couldn't fight that if I wanted to, and I couldn't bullshit you or anybody else or myself enough to try and talk and talk Ghost Rider up on that. And it is a testament to what Image was doing, what Image was doing for comic books at the time. Todd McFarlane and his coming off his run from Spider-Man and so much more to go to Image and create a brand new character that just completely. And as great as the cartoon was, though, if you take it out of the comic book industry, Spawn had no real influence on pop culture. If you were a fan, or you knew who Spawn was, maybe you saw the movies, maybe you watched the cartoon, maybe you read the comics, you liked them. But if you ask people by and large who Spawn is, I'd venture to guess the percentage is going to be much higher that they don't know who. Now, if you take pictures, they may recognize him, but again, I would say that the percentage is probably larger that they don't know who he is. But if you take a picture of Ghost Rider, most pop culture is going to know who he is. And weirdly enough, like on a level of like how the Punisher symbol has become a huge thing in pop culture, and in society in general. So his lasting effect, of course, I would put mostly up to his look, because if you ask all of those people who they are, and they're like, "That's the Ghost Rider," they're not going to know anything about him. Probably not even know his name. But the same is going to be said for Spawn.
Yeah.
Um, so I'd say they're pretty neck and neck in that sense, but I would say Ghost Rider influence on society and pop culture and everything else has a much stronger hold.
All
Right
right.
on.
Especially considering, to Brian's point on that, they had to shut him down for a few years in the 80s because of the Satanic Panic. If he didn't have, they didn't just shut everything down. It was demonic, Satanist
Yeah.
type of material that they deemed that way. And in comic books, there wasn't a lot of it, but Ghost Rider was one of them.
Yeah. I like it. Well, let's start going into final thoughts.
Final round. Fight!
1 to 2 minutes each of you. Give your final stand on why your character is the best. And
All right.
go ahead and include just like a favorite moment.
I guess to go on this one. So Spawn, as I mentioned multiple times on this right now, he is more than just a character. He's an icon, as it is in design, his look, the action figures that Tom McFarlane has designed. I mean, Tom McFarlane makes his money solely on those action figures essentially anymore. And what he did for comic books in general, but not just comic books, but Image specifically. He brought up a floundering third company and brought him up near the levels of the giants or Marvel and DC. And he did that solely on his back. Um, I mentioned earlier he's the only one in his universe, so whenever there's a big bad, he has to be the one to take it on and deal with it. Sometimes he is the big bad, sometimes he brings or is the cause of the big bad, but he's the one that always has to deal with the consequences. Um, Al Simmons specifically, where some of the other characters they you are out there in Marvel, DC, anywhere else, honestly, they don't have that. You don't have a character that is able to not only hold their own in a comic, but hold their own in the world of comic.
Okay.
So my argument here is going to be, or my final thoughts, I should say. You more argued for Todd McFarlane than you did Spawn, and this isn't a Todd McFarlane argument. So my feelings on that are like, okay, so if you take who created who, and you have somebody like Todd McFarlane, who again was prolific in comic industry through and through. I can't argue. I don't know who you could you put up. Maybe Stan Lee.
Yeah, Stanley, Kirby, somebody like that.
Jack Kirby, yeah, somebody like that. I mean, now Roy Thomas created Ghost Rider. He was editor in chief in the 70s for Marvel and has helped create Wolverine, Vision, Luke Cage, Iron Fist. I could go on, like, because he was there for the 70s. He was started in the 60s, and then he was editor in chief for Marvel 70s.
Yeah.
So like he was there to help create, and he created. So if you want to take, yes, Todd McFarlane being an artist is way more prolific in the industry, because like again, he's on par with Stan Lee, he's on par with Jack Kirby in name recognition for what they've done. Look up Roy Thomas and be like, man, this guy gave us people who are still profound today in comics and the movies.
Yep.
Now taking all of that out of there and only going on the basis of the character. I mean, you've gotten some amazing storylines through the years. I mean, look at what has Ghost Rider done. I mean, he not only has defeated every big villain, not only has he stopped Hulk during World War Hulk to the point where they had to come to an agreement because Hulk knew he wasn't going to win. Um, and they and he also beat the Avengers at a full force Avengers, Black Panther, Captain America, Thor. So like he is, to me, he is somebody as a character who withstands the test of time of what Marvel is. Like he is a mainstay. You're never going to lose Ghost Rider, just like you're never going to lose Captain America. It might change, as we've seen, but he is Ghost Rider. Spawn, as fantastic of a character as he is, he has been in and out himself in publication.
Yep.
And because it's Image, and because Image has more now, and he doesn't carry Image at all anymore, I'm not holding on to say Ghost Rider has held up Marvel, but in the 90s, yes, I would give it to Spawn. But in the grand scheme of since Spawn started, that's The Walking Dead. Things like that are holding it up, are making it, brought it to the upper echelon. So my final thoughts on that are Ghost Rider has continually been an epic force within Marvel, whereas Spawn isn't in Image even anymore, really. And one thing that I truly loved to talk, a moment from Johnny Blaze's history was when he fought the Avengers, and it's a fantastic read. People want to check it out.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Oh, well, the fun part, I get to sort through my thoughts and trying to decide who won. You both did really good. Yeah, I would say you both did a great job explaining the character, their backgrounds. Brian, you did a great job very early on talking about the influence that Spawn had on Image Comics, and that Todd McFarlane has had on the industry. Mick, I think you did a really good job rebuttaling a lot of that as well. Talking about how you can't really compare apples and oranges because a much smaller universe versus the Marvel universe, right? So I think that was a really good retort. I really liked your opening argument. He's got the coolest bike, and he's the coolest looking character. Yeah, no, I think there's definitely something to be said there. 100% of the time, you can show a picture of Ghost Rider to anyone over the age of 5, and they will love that picture. Spawn is still freaking cool, but
Oh yeah,
it is going to be a smaller, not much smaller, but there is going to be people like, yeah, all right, that's cool, I guess. I don't know. I've never heard anyone say that or even think that about Ghost Rider. So that being said, my personal favorite is Spawn. He is one of my all-time favorite characters. I actually just recently, within the last 6 months, went and rewatched the series on HBO. It's a great series. This is really tough. There's also another point that was brought up. I think Brian, you brought it up that Spawn is the greatest assassin, really, that ever lived. Mick, you had a good retort that Johnny Blaze is the greatest stuntman, or one of, right? An epic stuntman, and I love how you both kind of catered that. I think Brian, you talked about how he's got his powers, but because he's an epic assassin, he uses his weapons as well, earthly weapons. And so like I think that's really cool. While you guys are talking about that kind of was just going through my head. Like, yeah, that it makes sense that these two beings from completely different backgrounds of just immense power would also kind of shape their look in a way that's appropriate to their earth form, if you will. I just thought that was really cool. Just kind of an interesting tidbit that came to mind while I was listening to you guys. All in all, as far as the arguments go, though, you guys were pretty neck and neck. I think in this case, I'm going to go with Mick, and it's going to come down to the final thoughts. Because I think you did a good job.
I was a little taken back. I was surprised by this one. I was truly thinking Spawn.
Well, where you got me was the fact that it was almost your last line. Like, Spawn isn't carrying Image anymore, and he's out of it just as much as he's in it. Whereas Ghost Rider is still such a prolific character and such a powerhouse for all the teams in the entire multiverse. So I think based on that alone, I think Brian, I think what would have won it would have been had you focused more on the family aspect. The fact that he gets his bargain, but he's 5 years in the future and he can't remember, and so he's kind of piecing it together, and he is saving his best friend's child who he had with his wife. Like you did touch on it, but I think like that to me is the core of Spawn, and it's so much more powerful than a deal with the devil to save your stepdad. Uh,
Yeah.
so I think
Not stepdad, dad.
No, it's a
it's
stepdad.
his
Well, it
stepdad.
is a stepdad, but he didn't know at the time.
Yeah.
Well,
Don't give me that retcon stuff. We're going from the first one.
Well, we want to go first
stepdad.
one. The first one wasn't even Johnny. The first Ghost Rider was a guy named Clayton Poole, and he was literally a white, wore all white as a ghost and rode on horseback in the Wild West as a Marvel
That's
comic.
fair, but I'm talking about who came out first, and it was
Yes.
Johnny Blaze, the first introduced, and they only did that so they could make Danny catch his brother. Come on.
Yeah. That's all I'm gonna say. I think Brian, I think that would have won it had you focused more on that emotional arc, which I think is much stronger in Spawn. So I think that would have won it, but otherwise, I think you both were really neck and neck. The entire argument. Congratulations, Mick, you win.
Thank you, appreciate it.
All right.
Thanks again for having me, guys. This was fun.
Oh yeah, man. Anytime. We'll always reach out to you to see if there's anything that you want us to do with us on the ones we have planned out. And with that being said, guys, if you guys ever want to reach out to us on being a guest like Mick and have Tom favor you and let you win, then go ahead and reach us out here on our social medias. We'll give you that one more time. So you can hit us on social medias such as.
Hold on. I didn't want Mick to pull another.
No.
Sexist.
Well, I don't think that Caesar should have won, but he should have won that one. Only based on arguments, not it's Jack Nicholson.
Yeah.
I won't stop. Stop right there.
Just kidding. All right.
Actually, that should have been my argument. Well, I mean, he has flames on his head.
Yeah. All right, so you can hit us up on facebook.com/BeHeroMedia, instagram.com/BeHeroMedia.
On Twitter at BeHeroFights or BeHeroMedia, as well as you can hit us right here in the comments on YouTube. And while you're there, hit that subscribe button and the bell. And everything that is BeHero Media at BeHeroMedia.com.
That's right. Guys, thanks again so much for watching. If you want to get involved, we already talked about all that, but if there's any fights that you want to see, make sure you're joining the Instagram and all the social medias, and especially join the Discord that we have going with Showboys. 2 great podcasts and 1 great Discord channel server, whatever. But there's memes, there's debates, there's, spoiler-free talk, there's, and spoiler-ridden talk, It's kind of the whole gambit. So definitely join us on Discord. Link will be in the description. Yeah.
And Mick, while you're here, why don't you give a little plug for Scene Snobs and tell us what's going new for you guys?
Hey, appreciate it, guys. So I'm one of the hosts of the Scene Snobs podcast. You can check out all of our stuff on thescenesnobs.com. Our show is, based in pop culture and geek, but we try to engage in the absurdity of things a little bit more than normal. Like, we have a very talk about Marvel show. Love it, but everybody else talks about it, so we try to stay away from it. So we have our 2-year anniversary episode coming up on Tuesday, October 5th. So hopefully you guys want to check that out live. Starts at 8 p.m. Eastern, or you can listen to it anytime after.
Right on. Well, guys, I hope you guys enjoyed this one. It was definitely a fun one. These two have been fought all over the place, so we wanted to do something slightly a little different on how we took our shots at it. But with all that being said, guys, as always, fight on.
Ghost Rider.